I'm just going to jump in because there's a lot I wanted to share. This is a photo of Queen Elizabeth National Park, and I always find it really nice because you can see the park on one side, the community land on the other side, and then the far side is the Virunga National Park in the Congo. And I feel like it really illustrates how borders and the law can shape landscapes, lives, both human and non-human, and livelihoods. In 2001, a group of elephants was released from South Africa into Mozambique to celebrate the establishment of the Greater Limpopo Transfrontier Park. At that time, President Nelson Mandela declared, "I know of no political movement, no philosophy, no ideology, which does not agree with the Peace Park's concept, as we see it going into fruition today. It is a concept that can be embraced by all. In a world beset by conflicts and division, peace is one of the cornerstones of the future." Peace parks are a building block in this process, not only in our region, but potentially in the entire world. In practice, parks for peace, which have been defined by the IUCN, or the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, as transboundary conservation areas dedicated to the promotion, celebration, and or commemoration of peace and cooperation. But they've been incredibly inspiring, but it can be problematic sites of conflict. And so that's a little bit of what I've been looking at. Protected areas in general are susceptible to social conflict and structural violence by nature of being remotely delineated spaces or socio-political territories representing a dominant system of legal authority, typically a state-based park management system with parastatal wardens and rangers as law enforcement. In Africa, they've been criticized for their colonial origins, for their influence from foreign NGOs and private enterprises or Nature Inc., and for utilizing interventions that are considered unjust, that inequitably distribute costs and benefits to marginalized people, or for even coercive or heavy-handed tactics like green militarization. The negative impacts stories of the negative impacts displacing indigenous peoples from their lands or biocultural customs, rural or local communities losing access to their livelihood essential resources, or the global south, or the so-called third world, where most of the world's biodiversity remains, being disconnected from wildlife in order to prioritize external values like international tourism and pristine or untouched nature, trophy hunting, offsets and ecosystem service schemes, and even research. So transboundary conservation also, because it tends to be a government-to-government collaboration, involves decision-making at a fairly high level, making it difficult for local communities or conservation-impacted groups to voice their grievances. And sometimes in desperation or aggression, they can turn to criminal activities like hunting or poaching or even revenge killings of wildlife and harassment of park rangers. So in a way, they represent places where the pursuit of ecological peace, or peace between humans and nature, comes at the cost of social peace, or peace between peoples, with tenuous positive impact on international peace, or peace between nations. There's been little evidence that transboundary conservation areas actually do contribute to peace. In fact, many of the long-time transboundary conservation practitioners have mentioned that they can actually trigger or aggravate conflicts, and they typically require peace as a precondition to even becoming established, and that transboundary collaboration can easily paralyze at any renewal of conflict. This challenges the environmental peacemaking theory of Konka and Debelko and others, who argue that transboundary natural resource management can serve as a neutral issue that brings conflicting parties to the table for wider dialogue and peace building. So while the link between transboundary conservation areas and conflict seems to be stronger than the link with peace, it kind of raises, for me, the question that, is it that parks for peace or transboundary conservation areas cannot be effective mechanisms for peace, or is it that they have not yet been properly designed to do so? So the objective with this research was to kind of look at how transboundary conservation agreements, or the legal agreements between the countries, can contribute to positive peace by identifying opportunities for contemporary conflict resolution, for international peace, social peace, and ecological peace. Contemporary conflict resolution identifies institutions, international law, and cosmopolitan democracy, all of which have to do with the law, as critical in the pursuit of prevention during conflict formation, peacekeeping during violent conflict, peacemaking to achieve conflict transformation, and then peace building for social change. It's contemporary conflict resolution sees conflict formation arising out of the need for social change, manifesting as conflict and either violently or non-violently leading to a process of conflict transformation, which results in further social change in which marginalized or suppressed groups can articulate their interests and challenge existing norms and power structures. So in my case, I look kind of to political ecology to help to contextualize a lot of the transboundary conservation area grievances and framing the need for social change. The transboundary conservation areas themselves are the sites of conflict, or not violent or non-violent. And then what I'm proposing is that transboundary conservation area laws can assist in a non-violent process of conflict transformation, whereby social change is achieved in ways that the norms and power structures are recalibrated for greater justice, and thereby conflict resolution or peace. So for methodology, I'm looking at literature, obviously, and some of which I've shared a bit. And then what I did was put together a survey for transboundary conservation area practitioners. And the idea there was partly to actually help collect transboundary area agreements, because they tend to actually have copies of them that are not always easily available online. And also to understand why or how transboundary conservation began. Did some of those places experience conflict? Were they violent? Did the laws actually address or help them respond to those conflicts? And what was, key to their success or some of the challenges that they experienced. So about 500 different people were targeted in that survey, all based on expert networks that are people known or people who are part of transboundary protected area networks. 297 responded, although most of them didn't finish, so there were only 88 completed surveys. But they represent about 40 different countries and over 100 different transboundary conservation areas. Then I spent November through May in Uganda, based out of Uganda, and then on 3 of its border areas there. So there's the Greater Virunga landscape with Uganda, Rwanda, Congo as a transboundary conservation area. And then on the northern border with South Sudan is the Landscapes for Peace. And then on the eastern border with Kenya is the Mount Elgon transboundary ecosystem. With the case studies, I was mostly looking to interview and also to observe how the transboundary conservation works on the ground, and also to try and understand whether there were traditional or indigenous peace processes that existed. I interviewed about 60 different stakeholders, mainly park management, rangers, some of the security like military and intelligence personnel, local leaders, local government, some of the NGOs that participate in the transboundary conservation. And what I was trying to do there was to get a mapping of law as it's written, the actual transboundary agreements, law as it is in practice, how they're actually implementing it or what's existing on the ground, and then law as it should be for peace in terms of peace and conflict resolution. So just to show you the actual case sites, you can see the 3 different transboundary areas that are highlighted there, and these are all part of Africa's Great Rift Valleys, the Eastern Rift and then the Western Rift Valley. I'm going to have to skip these, I think, for time, but we can come back to it later. It's just a little bit more of each in detail. So most of my work there was also trying to understand the complexity of the different types of conflicts, again back in terms of international conflicts, social conflicts, and ecological conflicts, of what's happening in the 3 landscapes. Instead of going through that table, I wanted to maybe just share the story of the Bakakonjo and the Basongora to give you an idea of how these 3 different types of conflicts are interrelated, and also how conflicts in the 3 different landscapes are connected. So cattle keepers like the Basongora move with their animals through the landscape, despite conflicts with park management, but that usually when they enter into the parks, they get pushed out, and then they have to confront the Bakonjo, who are the cultivators on the outside. The Basongora had lost nearly all of their traditional land to the colonial gazettement of Queen Elizabeth National Park and then Virunga National Park in the Congo. In 2006-2008, about 8,000 of them entered the Congo Park and then were pushed into the Uganda Park. And the Bakonjo, who were also disenfranchised or moved from their lands when the Ruwenzori Mountains National Park just north of there was gazetted, decided that they would also settle in the park, taking advantage of the fact that there were 8,000 cattle keepers in there as well. So the park managers decided to come together and try to figure out what to do with all these park encroachers. And then the Ugandan government ended up allocating about 30,000 hectares of land to the Basongora. The Bakonjo felt this wasn't quite fair, and they'd always kind of had problems with the Ugandan government. Actually, in the end of 2016, when I was just kind of newly there, the Bakonjo and the Ugandan government had a conflict that escalated into a siege of the Rwenzori Palace. The king was arrested, over 100 royal guards and civilians were slaughtered inside of the palace, and then they were accused of trying to arm for a secessionist movement, armed and equipped by their Congolese tribesmen. So the Bakonjo have had problems for a long time. They had organized a movement against the British occupiers, and then they formed a group called the National Army for the Liberation of Uganda, or NALU, with the support of the president in Congo and the president in Kenya. And then around 1995, they actually came into contact in the Congo with the Sudanese Khartoum government, who was at the time funding and equipping the Interahamwe, or the FDLR, in Rwanda, which were the genocidaires during that time. And Khartoum linked them up with another anti-Museveni, who's the president of Uganda, group called ADF, or the Allied Democratic Forces. And together they basically took back the ancestral lands of the Bakonjo, the Ruwenzori National Park. And they were known, or at least linked by Interpol, to ivory and mineral trafficking and all kinds of other environmental crimes. Khartoum at that time was supporting them because Museveni was supporting their enemy, the SPLA, because the SPLA was helping Museveni basically fight the Lord's Resistance Army in northern Uganda. So with the presence of the SPLA and the LRA and the cattle raiding tribes across that northern border of South Sudan, Kenya and Uganda, arms were proliferating in the communities. So in the park boundary disputes and all of the encroachment that was happening around Mount Elgon transboundary ecosystem actually became fairly violent at the time. So you can kind of get an idea how connected and messy all of these conflicts are, and how important it is actually that peace in all three of the landscapes is for each, piece in any one of the landscapes. So going back to that question again, is how can law, which actually has, sets the rules of so many of these places, it was the thing that created these colonial protected areas that were then formalized later during the post-colonial era, how can they actually help instead to transform the conflicts of many of that they're so connected to the that one. So just to give you a little bit of an idea of how the transboundary agreements came together in the three landscapes. The Greater Virunga Transboundary Collaboration, or that's the case study on the Democratic Republic of Congo, Rwanda, and Ugandan border, actually began really informally in 1959 with mountain gorilla research. In 1979, they began to organize anti-poaching patrols and education programs. And then it wasn't until 2004 that they had their first trilateral MOU, or Memorandum of Understanding, and that was between the park authorities. Then in October 2005, they had a ministerial declaration. In 2006, their first transboundary strategic plan, and then they set up a trinational multi-institutional governance scheme. And it wasn't until 2015 that they signed a treaty, and that's now awaiting ratification from the three countries. In Kirapo, there was some informal cross-border collaboration. Kirapo is the Landscapes for Peace transboundary landscape between South Sudan and Uganda. So there was some informal collaboration with South Sudan. It was still part of Sudan, but with the conflict, that all stopped. It wasn't until 2007, 2010 that WCS, the Wildlife Conservation Society, and USAID started to do some aerial surveys to find out if there was any wildlife left after all those years of wars. And they basically attempted to rebuild the park systems in South Sudan and as part of the post-conflict nation building strategy. And at that time, they brought together the governments of South Sudan and Uganda to sign an MOU on the management of transboundary landscapes for peace. Since then, there were a few cross-border visits, but there's been insecurity back again in South Sudan, and so the park management actually has completely fled on the South Sudanese side, and it's just military personnel in the area. So the Uganda Wildlife Authority has tried to collaborate with the military, but they're always getting shuffled around the country to different deployments, and they've also been linked to natural resource trafficking in that area. So it's a bit difficult to cooperate. In Mount Elgon, there was a formal transboundary program called Merisep under the IUCN in 2004, funded by the Norwegians and the Swedish. And since this was considered a key water tower for Lake Victoria, the project was actually nestled under the East African Community and the Lake Victoria Basin Commission. There's been a draft MOU in negotiation as part of that project. It hasn't been signed yet by either of the two sides, and its focus is mainly on integrated conservation and development, so it doesn't really address conflict directly or security in the region, including disarmament of the communities. But if we look at the three legal frameworks through the lenses of international peace, social peace, and ecological peace, which I've kind of mapped out here, and link them, we can actually link them back to the conflict mapping that I showed you earlier with the other table. And in these cases, specific conflicts that were identified, you can see that they're addressed in some cases in the transboundary agreements, and in other cases the agreements are silent or the interventions are indirect. So just to give you a little bit of an example, this is the Greater Virunga landscape with the original conflict, different types of conflicts identified there, and then the different parts of the legal agreements. But in that case, they talk about peace building, disarmament of negative forces, restoring protected areas that have been impacted by war, enhancing conservation benefits to communities to alleviate some of the negative impacts. But they don't talk about ethnic conflicts, land grabbing, or human-wildlife conflict, which are some of the conflicts that are most on the minds of the people in the region. So there's still some gaps even in the written laws. Then on the ground, the most prominent conflict resolution mechanisms that I found there were the transboundary institutions, some of the transboundary projects, and then in some cases traditional or indigenous mechanisms. The only transboundary landscape that actually has a very formal transboundary institution is the Greater Virunga landscape with the Greater Virunga Transboundary Collaboration Executive Secretariat. But it's actually a very powerful tool for conflict resolution. It can facilitate multi-level, multi-stakeholder dialogues and decision-making as needed when the conflicts arise or regularly on a periodic basis. This creates an adaptive transboundary conflict resolution platform that can self-tailor a bit for different situations. It can bring in the ministers if it needs to, or even the heads of state or local security personnel, depending on what the situation is. The Executive Secretariat actually also has legal personhood to coordinate activities and partner with other actors in the landscape, which means that they're able to actually bring in a much more diverse body of actors and to grow this quote-unquote sort of habit of cooperation. They currently have two transboundary programs that really target peace. One is for capacity development, and the other is actually for water. And then one of the more overlooked or underappreciated are the traditional leaders and some of the community peace processes. I don't think I can really get too much into that, but in the North Kivu, for example, the militias, in places where the militias still control the territories and exploit the natural resources, it's generally, you can pretty much assume that the local leaders either tacitly, explicitly, or coercively are aware and sanction these activities. So this means that the cooperation of the traditional leaders in sort of neutralizing these negative forces is incredibly important. And usually the local leaders are the first resort when trying to solve social conflicts within the community and when community conflicts arise. And their role can be especially important when the government institutions are weak or the institutional counterparts are unavailable, like on the South Sudanese border. It's actually the Catholic Diocese, which is the only group that still maintains cross-border peace dialogues in that area. And the Uganda Wildlife Authority actually works closely with them because of that. I'm going to skip that one too, sorry. So, as we know, conservation is not just a neutral actor in a landscape, and neither is environmental law. The socio-legal peace and conflict mapping that I've tried to demonstrate a bit of here can help to identify the violences and conflicts in the landscape, legal interventions for peace, and also the gaps for deeper conflict transformation. If we look for the words peace or conflict in the agreements, though, we don't typically find very much. When we look for the laws that address underlying elements of the conflict and then to the practices on the ground, there's a much richer socio-legal system working for conservation, conflict resolution, and peace. But merely designating territories for peace is insufficient. As we know from the South Sudanese case, the transboundary collaboration can not exist even though the MOU is there. The conservation interventions also need to improve their strategies, integrating international peace, social peace, and ecological peace, recognizing that one cannot be achieved without the other. From the case studies, there wasn't a very clear correlation between a stronger legal framework and more peace. The transboundary conservation area that had the most formal, most comprehensive legal framework, the Greater Virunga landscape, had the most advanced and developed transboundary collaboration, but it was the legal agreements that tended to follow the practice on the ground and not the other way around, and much of the region is still suffering from violence and conflict. The agreements can provide formal support to the park authorities to bring in other partners that are non-traditional to conservation, including peace and security personnel. It also gives them legitimacy to be able to extend into areas outside of conservation. So that gives potential, I think, for growth in peace building through the environment in the regions. I don't know how the time. Okay, so the other piece is that, as we learned from the South Sudanese case, that the collaboration may not always be between the park authorities. A government-to-government approach can be limiting and sometimes very unwelcome in these insecure borderlands. So the small-scale peace practices or the traditional processes can be very effective, but they're not currently recognized in the transboundary legal agreements. So there's some room there to try and strengthen and support those local processes. In fact, many of the key partners in transboundary conservation are not parties to the agreements. Not even, we mentioned not the communities, but also not the donors or the NGOs or the potential peace spoilers who actually have a lot of influence in peace and conflict in these territories. The donors and the NGOs are actually often pushing for the legal agreements, but they don't ever become party to them, so they're not actually bound to anything that's within them. In the Greater Virunga landscape, the Executive Secretariat is now actually signing MOUs with individual partners to kind of try and make up for that. So although transboundary conservation doesn't require formal legal agreements, I believe that legal agreements can enhance collaboration for peace. The next steps would be to ensure that these legal agreements incorporate the different types of peace, that they take more of a preventative and maybe even regenerative approach to peace instead of just reactive when the conflicts arise. And this can help a lot of the, allow them to sort of address the conflict issues that don't necessarily appear as outright open violent conflict in the region. So I think I'm going to thank you there and leave it at that. That's probably too hard to read, but it's a Martin Luther King quote. Anyway, thank you. I guess you're going to be next.
We have a couple of minutes for questions, starting with students first.
Nathan? Okay.
Thanks, Elaine. There's a lot to dig into there. I'm going to ask a bit of a lateral question. So I know that alongside this work that you've been working with the IUCN in a variety of different ways over the last bunch of years, including launching your recent group underneath the Commission on Environmental or Economic, Ecological and Social Policy. And I'm just curious to hear you reflect a little bit on how those pieces, the research and the high-level policy work and the starting of this group focusing on these issues kind of comes together through this process of your PhD.
Yeah, thanks for that. It's actually been kind of interesting because part of what I started to write about in one of the introductory chapters is the history of transboundary conservation areas. And the IUCN has been really active in defining that history. You know, they say the first one was 1932, Waterton Glacier International Peace Park between Canada and the US, and then after that there was, you know, Europe and some of these other transboundary conservation areas. And they've been repeating the same story over and over in different publications. But what I actually realized was that actually transboundary conservation areas predate that by about thousands of years. You know, communities had conservation areas and then borders came through them, or sometimes they actually developed conservation areas on borders as part of a resolution between communities. You know, and so I think that that's been an interesting thing, kind of, is the IUCN story and then being kind of involved with them and publications that repeated that story, and then in my own work kind of trying to share a different story. That's the only thing I can kind of reflect on in my personal experience with that. In the back?
So
or someone else?
Peace comes first and then Peace Park comes after that?
I would say that in the practice, yeah. The places where peace parks have been proposed where there's ongoing armed conflict, like K2 Sayachin, Israel-Palestine, the peace parks are still conceptual. You know, there's nothing happening there. The places where they've come together, like in Southern Africa, was post-peace, right? And in the greater Virunga landscape, it's a little bit interesting because violence has been kind of ongoing, but, you know, there hasn't been outright war between the three countries recently. Yeah? Okay. Oh yeah, so that was in the very beginning. I was explaining that that's Queen Elizabeth National Park. And the right side, where you can kind of see savanna land and some brush, right? And then in the far distant dark green again, that's Virunga National Park. So that's Congo. And then this is community land, where it's all like dense agriculture.
And so is the produce from the community land shared by the two parties on the two sides of the border?
When they're close to the border, yeah. They move back and forth with products. Yeah. But when there's a big park dividing them, not so much. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.